This is the opening slide from my 2019 Juanita Brooks lecture. And please, if you'll excuse me, I want to actually kind of fix something that I didn't do in that lecture. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, yes, it doesn't like me.
It went.
Did it go?
Yeah.
Okay, it went. You just have to push it harder. I'm going to do something I didn't do completely, and that's answer one of the questions. If you want to see the lecture itself and hear the stories and see the comedy routine, then you can find it on YouTube. And I occasionally go back and wonder who that goofball is standing on the stage. Looks a lot like me. I want to clarify something that I didn't do there, and I think it's important because I want to be fair to Juanita and her history. There is lots and lots and lots about the story of that book, particularly, and about how Juanita started off as a writer and became a historian and then became something else. And it's, I don't think, very well understood. At the end of her life, Dale Morgan lays dying of cancer in Berkeley, California. She writes him a letter and she says, "Dale, you're right. I am not a historian. You were more, when you said I was a folklorist, that's my venue." And I think that there's something to that. It's not that she couldn't tell a good story. She told very good stories. But there's only 2 books and maybe 3 of hers that even have footnotes. One of them is Mountain Meadows Massacre, and the reason specifically for that is Dale told her, you must have documentation. And she was never really comfortable with documentation in the sense that he was, which was overnoted for virtually everything. But let's go from that. So when we talk about Juanita Brooks, Levi Peterson called her a heroic writer. And I think that's very appropriate. And I think those of us who are here and listening understand why that is. We think. The issue is not why is she is a heroic writer. Why is she a heroic writer? What is it that makes a hero? All right? Or as I would phrase it differently, what in the practice and writing of the culture of her time makes her different than other people who are doing similar things at roughly the same time? Okay? I think the answer is heroes are made in conflict. They come out of conflict. Okay? So then what's the question that goes along with this? What was the conflict? Okay? And it's not the massacre. Barbara nailed a good portion of it, and I'm going to kind of talk about a couple of things as we go through here. This was the timeline for my presentation several years ago. I looked at Juanita Brooks and the writing of the Mountain Meadows Massacre from 3 different levels. And you all have been on an airplane, right? You look down from 30,000 feet and what do you see? Lots of detail? No, but you can see patterns, right? So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about, in terms of my presentation that obviously attracted you here, I want to reprise her writing, I want to reappraise her writing, and then we will reprise Juanita as we get there. Is that fair? All right, here we go. So, Juanita Brooks reprised. And I can't tell the whole story, I don't have time for it. The important point of this is that in the writing of Mountain Meadows Massacre, that book connected her to some very, very important people, both just important in themselves, but also in the importance of developing her as a person, as a writer, as a factor who could do things, a woman who could do things. She started off to write the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the story of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, as an article, not as a book. And she wasn't going to put any footnotes, and she was going to publish it, or the goal was to publish it in Atlantic Magazine. Now can you imagine the story of a slaughter in Atlantic? No. Which probably would have been the answer that the editors would have given her. So what happens is that she bumps into Dale Morgan, and there's a story that I can't go into. And Dale literally holds her hand through the whole process. She never went to Washington, D.C., but if you look at the footnotes of Mountain Meadows Massacre, you'll find an awful lot of federal records citations. Well, where does she get the stuff if she's never been there? Dale Morgan literally handed her literally everything that he had extracted from newspapers, from federal records, from documents, from all kinds of things. And he didn't take any credit. He just simply said, you tell the story. You're the one appropriate to telling the story. All right? That connects her. Dale connects her to another woman named Fawn Brody. Okay? Connects her also to another individual, a couple of other individuals, including Bernard DeVoto, including a number of others. And actually, let's see, Tony, you're going to have to help me out. The house down here on the flat, was it right down this direction, right along Main Street? The older house? Not the house on the hill. There was an older house. Anyway, she lived down this way when she was the dean of women down here. And she had a neighbor around the corner by the name of Nels Anderson. How many people know Nels Anderson? Okay, a few. Nels Anderson was the one who really introduced her to the whole practice of history. So this book, this process connects her. Books are written by communities, they're not written by individuals. Okay? We know people, we interact with people, we borrow their thinking, we help with their understanding, they bring us insights, they force us to ask questions, and that's how the miracle that we talk about books gets written. Mountain Meadows Massacre was one of those. It was a tremendously important book for her. She wasn't the one who came up with a publisher either. Morgan told her, you have to have a publisher outside of Utah, and with enough gravitas that the cultural authorities, by whom you can guess who he meant, the cultural authorities aren't going to be big enough to push on them, and that's why he suggested going to Stanford University Press, who was completely disinterested. They didn't want to do the book. So some other help came came together and put the whole thing together. What's interesting to me is that the book was printed in 1,000 copies, which was standard short-run printing for the time. But Juanita had to buy, or ended up buying, the remainder of the collection. It didn't sell particularly well. It sold importantly to a number of people who wanted things, who made that connection. But as a whole, it only went through one printing and then never was redone until the second edition. That says something interesting about the maturity of the culture for whom she was writing it. Once it was there, then it was out. The bugaboo was out on the table. But past that point, nobody really felt that they needed to deal with it. All right, I'm getting stuck here. We're going to have to keep moving. Let me go forward with this. Reappraising. Barbara mentioned the New Mormon history, and I think it's important. I want to put a little bit of more context into that one, because there is some fascinating stuff that happens with this. The term, the New Mormon history, refers to a style of writing that really crops up with the beginnings of academic history, a subset of academic history in the 1950s and the 1960s. Okay? It takes its name from this article right here. This is actually the origin of the term, the New Mormon history. Moses Rishin was a University of, now University of San Francisco State University professor. He was a cultural historian, and he was on leave in Sweden at the time when he wrote this, but he had simply sat down and started musing and comes up with some interesting things. He talks about this New Mormon history as the origin of a couple of things, and here's the real important point. The New Mormon history, or the modern Mormon history, the Latter-day Saint history, was written as if the saints were people. And people have a past. And the past reflects them, not the truth claim that they may have as well. Now that was significant because to Rishin, he was thinking, well, this is just Leonard Arrington and his ilk, and he actually names Arrington in this. But if you take a look at the top, and up here in the top corner, you can start seeing, and I don't have enough room to get it all on here, he starts listing a number of works that were very important in what he thought the New Mormon history was. Interestingly enough, what's not there? Well, there's a bunch of things that are there. So, and Rishin identifies what's Thomas O'Day's book, The Mormons, which is a sociological study. And it went through a second edition a little bit later. And Arrington Great Basin Kingdom, and the founding of the Mormon History Association, and the founding of Dialogue. This is what he thinks is the new Mormon history. But he's missing the point, I think. He's missing a point importantly. And that is that there were other things that were happening before. And you'll notice that one toward the end down here, the Mountain Meadows Massacre by Juanita Brooks. There was an entire generation earlier, of which Juanita was one. There was an entire generation earlier who was plowing the cultural ground, waiting for people to pay closer attention. Now, I think, as I look at it, both as a social historian and as a librarian, I think probably the first real, honest-to-goodness manifestation of this is Dale Morgan's State of Deseret in 1940. It's the first major work of history that also has footnotes and cites its sources and doesn't just claim things, it actually puts them out there. All right? Now, I got myself lost here. Just a second. Oh well, we'll just keep talking. I'll ignore the notes. You can see that there's a pattern happening, right? There are pioneers that happen prior to the time that the giants stand. And everybody, and I knew Leonard very slightly in my great days as an undergraduate and a graduate student. And I would occasionally go to Leonard's house, and he was so gracious. And he was one of the first people that would always say, I always stood on the work of other people. He never claimed to be the fountainhead of anything. He was very grateful for who he was and who had gone before him. Well, Juanita was of the generation, and her work, the Mountain Meadows Massacre specifically, was of the generation that plowed the ground, that made it possible for later academics who came with this little more dispassionate view of the past to actually write things that were significant. Okay? They were the ones who fought the fight. And well, we don't have time to do all of those. Anderson's book, Desert Saints, he actually wrote here in St. George. It was written, it went back east, it went to the University of Chicago Press, and Anderson was a University of Chicago graduate. And it was very well received, but it was almost as badly hated as No Man Knows My History, even though it has virtually nothing but praise for the people who came out this direction. It's just that the cultural ground wasn't comfortable with that kind of inquiry. All right, so let's move forward and do a little bit more. Let's talk about revaluing Juanita Brooks and what she does and how she does it, okay? And I want to explain this. Now, we're looking up here from 30,000 feet, looking down on Juanita and the writing of Mountain Meadows Massacre, because there's some important perspectives and patterns that I think starting to crop up. What is the contest, or what's the competition or the conflict that I see happening as she's writing this particular work? And I think it comes from the tension that is growing up around the 1930s, 1940s, 1930s, where she really gets interested in the massacre, into this idea between two different forms of history, of forms of telling the story, and things that the way we explain types of material. So you could take a look at it as the type of history that Andrew Jensen wrote, which was encyclopedic, which was just basically facts, which was very laudatory, which included everybody as you could get it together, versus the New Mormon history that would step back a little bit and said, okay, now, what's really happening? Why is this happening in the way that things are done? Andrew Jensen never asked why. The church historians department at that point never really asked why. They just said, here is the story. Okay? There's something else that's happening too, and that is that traditional Latter-day Saint history was published for the people who would read it, right? For the people who were descendants, second and third generation of the people who had lived that history. On the other hand, the New Mormon history, and when you look at the Mountain Meadows Massacre, it was written about Latter-day Saints, but was it really written for them? I'd argue not. And I think there's probably a pretty good way to look at that. Publishing outside the culture opens sometimes uncomfortable doors into a group of people that many people would just prefer to have kept closed, okay? Looking beyond a culture, interpreting it for somebody that isn't a belonger is a little uncomfortable. But I think that's exactly what happened beginning in the 1940s and with Mountain Meadows Massacre and other things, okay? By writing for internal, what sociologists called in-group, by writing for in-group readers, you could tell the stories with the expectations that were in place. When you start telling stories for outside, all of a sudden, the assumptions about who is right and who is wrong are awfully hard to make the same kind of arguments about. It makes it difficult. In the case of this case, it were non-Mormon, non-Utah readerships. Okay? Mountain Meadows Massacre was published in California. No Man Knows My History was published in New York. O'Day's The Mormons was published in Chicago. These are not Latter-day Saint enclaves in the way that they had been. And in the 1940s, and I've got a whole other presentation on this, the Latter-day Saints had developed their own internal publishing that fed themselves and fed their interests in history. And as a result, that's what they got. This was from the outside. Something else, and this is important. Traditional history of any sort, not just the Latter-day Saints, but traditional history of any culture. When I was in the South, it was about the Baptists and about the Confederates and whatnot. It was always or often first-hand experience. This is my grandfather's story. Okay, remember Juanita's first book on Dudley Levitt? It's all about people that people already knew. That was important. On the other hand, when you're looking at it from the outside, you start having to not play the game of, well, so-and-so knows so-and-so. You have to say, okay, well, here's my authority for this. This is why I can say that. And all of a sudden, personal testimony is interesting, but it isn't considered evidence in the same way as when you can point to a written document that says X, this is what happened, or this is what was done, or something like that, okay? So on the one hand, on the other hand, I guess, on the other hand, the new Mormon history and modern Latter-day Saint history, as we look at it today, is true in the sense that it's both factual and evidentiary. It makes people comfortable with the story and the evidence that's laid out in front. But traditional history is also true, but it's true in a different sense. It's true in a way that it tells our story in the way we are comfortable receiving it. It's also true in the sense that it makes us feel good about who we are. Do you see the difference? Notice we use the same term to refer to both. They're both true. Okay? I think we have to be fair to everybody, no matter what stripe we have. We all participate in both types of history, no matter where we are or when we live or who we're members of. This is part of the way that history is told. Okay, on the one hand, okay, there's the other part of it. On the one hand, the new Latter-day Saint history, the new Mormon history, is about context, explaining, letting people live in the time and the function that they lived at and where they lived. And on the other hand, traditional history is frequently, not always, but frequently about nostalgia. Looking back fondly. It's about remembering. And I have, again, a whole presentation about the function of remember and what remember. I'll tell you what, if you think Latter-day Saints are worried about their history, let me take you to the American South. Okay? That's where I did my degree work. It's very important. Okay? The real lesson about both of these types of storytelling, and again, we're looking way up at patterns from 30,000 feet, is this. History is never about the past. Right? Dead people don't buy books. Right? So, if you're going to write books or if you're going to write articles, who's going to read them? whoever is alive today. That means that history meets my need for needing to understand my past, or the past, however we want to say it. Whether it's the 250th anniversary of a country, or whether it's the 100th anniversary of an invention, or whether it's the 10th anniversary of something that happens. That's what history is for. It's for us today. So that's one reason why historians are never out of a job, because each generation will reinterpret the past to meet its needs so we can understand our present and how we got to here as well. All right? Now, that raises a couple of broad, what's called historiological philosophy issues that I'll just mention very quickly, okay? On the one hand, we have the difference between history told in our sense of things, imposing our values onto the past. Okay, we all know that the Mountain Meadows Massacre was a terrible thing. Therefore, since our forefathers were not terrible, they couldn't have done it. Right? See how that works? That's presentism. That's reading the present onto the past. On the flip side, there's an approach called historicism, which is basically the practice of letting the past tell its own story. Of not saying, this is what I want it to be, but here's how I can understand it, and I can see how this step and this step and this step grows out of that. I remember years ago I had a home teaching companion who had come from southern Utah, who with a straight face, as straight as they came, told every folklore story about the Mountain Meadows Massacre and his great-great-great-grandfather who had participated as perfectly just retribution. Okay? Which side was he looking at? He didn't want to be the descendant of a murderer, and so he was imposing his ideas onto the past, making the past valuable for him. Okay? So there's a couple of things that get valued differently depending on how, and it's not the only way to approach things, but these are two very important tensions that are happening. And this happens especially in the 1930s and in the 1940s and in the 1950s. And eventually in the 1960s, when the Mormon History Association emerges out of the Western, or the Organization of American Historians, all of a sudden there's this new game in town that nobody can suppress anymore because it's no longer part of the culture. It's something else, and it's attracting people from outside of there. So my answer to fill in the last part of this, why is Juanita Brooks a historic writer? Do you understand what I think the conflict was? This idea of competing forms of storytelling and the way that we approach the past. I think the answer is that is because she helped to pioneer an approach that is meaningful to us today. It's what we value now. And because of that, we can honor Juanita Brooks and Mountain Meadows Massacre and St. George and the culture that she grew out of as truly the rich culture that it actually is. And that's it.